What would happen if our greatest shared burden was lifted? Depression is the leading cause of disability, affecting over 300 million people around the globe. We lose 800,000 each year to suicide, more than murder and war combined. Yet we face an impossible void due to the desperate lack of resources in much of the world, leaving most of the suffering untreated. Now consider this. Most people with depression can be diagnosed and actually treated using new technologies. In the smartphone and internet age, we see an enormous opportunity. We are building a global depression network to provide culturally adapted methods for diagnosing, treating, and continuously monitoring depression. We're calling it the Depression Grand Challenge worldwide. And when we launch, this global coalition will become the largest data collection effort ever in the field of mental health, unleashing untold insights that will fundamentally change our capacity to treat depression, sending lifelines that will transform hundreds of millions of lives. What would happen if our greatest shared burden was lifted? How would it feel? How would our world be transformed?
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome your MC, Lisa Kudrow, back to the stage.
That video really captures so much of why we're here today, to talk about lifting burdens and to create a healthier world. We'll hear more about UCLA's Depression Grand Challenge later this afternoon. We're fortunate to have next a leading mental health advocate, Gail Kamer Lieberfarb, who served as board chair and acting executive director of the National Mental Health Awareness Campaign founded by Tipper Gore. She's here to speak about mental health and human rights with two renowned women who have made a difference in the political arena at the national and international level. We're so happy to welcome former Second Lady Tipper Gore, and the Honorable Nancy Rubin, former U.S. Ambassador to United Nations Commission on Human Rights. Gail, I'll turn it over to you.
Hello. Hi. Hello. Hi. We have many important things to talk about today. Fabulous experiences and stories from two people who have been remarkable leaders. But I want to tell one little story. About 19 years ago, for a reason I can't remember, I was asked to be on the board of Tipper's National Mental Health Awareness Campaign, dedicated to erasing stigma. So we went to Washington, and after the first board meeting, which is where I met Nancy, both of us trying to go in the same doorway at the same time, we've become that close for these many years.
Thank you, Tipper.
And
You're welcome.
Yes. And then we were invited back to the Naval Observatory for a lunch. And we walked in, and of course Tipper was hosting as well as being the creator of the National Mental Health Awareness Campaign. And the first thing I noticed in the magnificent house was a drum set, which Tipper plays. Now, I don't know if any of you know his stories, but could you just tell everybody before we get to serious about the drums?
Oh, the drums. Well, I started when I was a teenager, and I loved playing the drums. I had an all-girls band, the Wildcats, named after, named after my mother's Buick, and I continued to do that, took some lessons and everything, and then later on I was able to sit in on some songs and play the drums with the Dead, with Willie Nelson for Farm Aid, at Equality Rocks with Katie Lang and Melissa Etheridge and a whole bunch of people. So they knew I played the drums, so they would have me come up and do a song and with them. And that has always been those have always been some of my best memories. It's been a lot of fun, and I still play a little bit.
I didn't know that.
Yes.
Sorry we don't have any here.
Yeah, well, it's okay.
You were both pioneers in Washington, D.C. in the 70s. What was the social and political environment like for women at that time? And please, Nancy.
So we're underscoring the 70s. That's a few years ago. I'm not quite sure we were thinking of ourselves as pioneers, but we were young and we were feisty. I was recruited to come to Washington by President Carter, who wanted to make government look like America. Guess what? Very few women in the various departments. And Tipper arrived at about the same time as this exquisitely authentic, beautiful voice, and the wife of then Congressman Al Gore. We had just come through the anti-war movement. By that I mean Vietnam. It feels like 100 years ago, but in fact, it unleashed all kinds of political activism. During that time, I met many activists, one of whom was Jane Fonda. The world was exploding with societal change. Does that sound like today? Identity politics were absolutely everywhere. The Black Panthers and the Native Americans were protesting against racism and police violence, again an issue of today. Women felt liberated as Roe versus Wade was passed. I had defined myself till then as a mother, a wife, a daughter, but not necessarily a leader or a change agent. And when I knew that the Equal Rights Amendment was being beaten back and I had been recruited to Washington as a woman, suddenly I had a different view of myself and felt that I was a representative of local women and women throughout the country. I met and became friends with Gloria Steinem. I wore big sunglasses, I dressed a little bit like her, and I took her message to heart. When we speak of feminism, racism, poverty, and all who are oppressed, our issues are linked, not ranked. I was on board. In the context of today, both Jane and Gloria were outspoken about their own mother struggles with mental health, and in Jane's case, suicide. As you may remember, men controlled all the levers of power. But in 1975, the Man of the Year on the cover of Time magazine was in fact a woman. Truly. In the White House, I was lucky enough to participate on the interagency task force on the impact of all the regulations that actually affected women. Before that time, that was not necessarily a consideration. It was a time where women in professions, in politics, economics, and the artistic realms were barely visible. The books, the TVs, and the newspapers were not particularly positive in their coverage of women. And I joined Betty Friedan, who wrote the book The Feminine Mystique and was given the moniker of having started the second wave of feminism. She created a task force on women, men, and media. And we went to all the producers, all the newspaper editors, and we took rosters of lists of women that we had compiled and all the expertise they had, and thus arrived women on panels as anchors, and though it happened slowly, it has happened wonderfully. And finally, I got involved with the politics of the only 3.7% of women in the Congress, and I chaired the Women's Campaign Research Fund. It was the first time, actually, that I came in touch with Tipper, and it has left a lasting soft spot in my heart. We began early together.
We did.
Tipper,
We did, yes.
please, tell us, tell us about your time in the 70s. And
Well, I would echo everything that she said. I mean, it's something that we all came through. She was extremely active and was a change maker, and that was terrific. I think women were waking up then to feminism and to our power, and we're beginning to express it. I mean, it's growing, and we're seeing more of this today. But as a new congressional wife in Washington in 1976, women were not really even invited to the parties that their husbands were invited to, for example. I mean, that's something we've talked about.
That was how we met.
Well,
Al Gore was at my home, and shamefully, Tipper was not.
nothing.
I was wounded in that moment, and it changed a consciousness for me forevermore.
But it speaks to the culture and the mores of the time, and they were beginning to be in transition, which was very, very exciting. And the newly elected members of Congress had wives, and then, as you pointed out, mainly wives, and they'd all, like myself, just gotten a graduate degree or had a job, so they weren't willing to just sit in Washington and not do anything and not continue to be active on issues that they'd been involved in, many that you've touched on. So we banded together and formed the Congressional Wives Task Force. And we would meet once a month, and we'd have speakers, and we would write reports, and we would talk to every member of Congress and about violence in the media, about nutrition, about the care of the elderly, and the homeless. And so I continued to work with the issue of homelessness as my platform increased in Washington. And I also continued to work on mental health issues because I had just gotten a graduate degree and I thought I was going to be a practicing psychotherapist. But instead I found a different platform, which we'll speak to a bit more later.
I'd like to now get into a discussion about mental health and what led each of us to become advocates, and how we participated together. Nancy, would you start off?
So sometimes you choose a cause, like all of you in this room, and sometimes a cause picks you. In the early 70s, my mother was dying from cancer, and I wanted to help prolong her life. She was a social worker, and I wanted to spend time with her in a purpose-driven way. And so I began something called community outreach to help support mental health services that were closing. In the 70s, those who needed mental health were really left quite desperate. And so who knew that this little organization that I founded called Community Outreach would eventually end up funding something called the D.D. Hirsch Community Mental Health Centers. Thank you for the recognition of this. There were secrets in our family. A member had committed suicide. I never knew that until years later. And the D.D. Hirsch Community Mental Health Centers now serve over 100,000 people a year in 11 centers across Southern California. And our materials are in 50 states and 27 countries. And now, bringing suicide out of the shadows, we are about to build the most comprehensive suicide prevention center of excellence in the country. So, that's a small initiative which then led me back again into the realm of Tipper, who really took the administration's opportunities to their absolute maximum as she created the National Mental Health Awareness Campaign.
Which grew out of the 1999 first ever White House Conference on Mental Health. And my whole purpose and that of those I worked with was to equalize mental health and health care in the minds of people, destigmatize it, and let people know that there is treatment for issues, diagnosis and treatment available, and that people don't have to suffer. There's 1 in 5 Americans that will deal with a mental health issue, either acutely or chronically in their family. I mean, that is, you know, a lot of people. And I should mention that we also worked really hard on the Mental Health Parity Act being passed in 1996, which stopped the discrimination that insurance companies were able to put on mental health care coverage and equalize it. And of course, we hopefully will continue to equalize that. But Gail was a wonderful chairwoman of the Mental Health Awareness Campaign, which grew out of the '99 conference. And you did a fantastic job with Ross Szabo, who's here. He's doing something else now, but still involved in mental health. Yes. But he was a speaker. Gail can tell us how many kids he reached over the years. He'd go into schools and colleges and talk about mental health issues. How many?
Well, we started when I was asked to be on the board, just serendipitously. I came into a board that was filled with professionals that Tipper had gathered, the editor of the Surgeon General's report, the head of the National Institute of Mental Health, and I really knew nothing. But it had been the plan to do public service announcements. So we did PSAs, and the first one was in partnership with MTV and was enormously successful. At that time, there were 20 million viewers of a public service announcement geared towards children, towards kids. And then we were going to move on to do adults and then seniors. And the work of the National Mental Health Awareness Campaign was exploring all of that and exploring how to reach those populations and how to reach seniors, et cetera. And as we started to think about it, and at that point I became the board chair, and the research suggested that it would be best to have a peer-to-peer program because people listen to others that are having similar situations to theirs, and that the stories matter. And at the same time as I was thinking this, I discovered this young man who's back in the room, who's quite brilliant, who was talking kind of locally, calling himself the Youth National Mental Health Awareness Campaign, which I then went to Washington and said to him, you can't call yourself that because this is Tipper's National Mental Health Awareness. It's too similar. And it took a year, but we got Ross Szabo, who is the most fantastic, charismatic, motivational speaker, to establish the Speakers Bureau, which we worked together on. And we were in 45 states, middle school, high school, and college. We reached millions of kids. And empirical testing showed that we increased guidance counselor visits by 500%. So I checked Ross. We then also, under the umbrella, formed the Mental Health Media Partnership, which was a resource for the entertainment industry to be able to phone up and say, well, how would I write a character that had bipolar disorder? And what would the reactions be to medications? And so we had that Mental Health Media Partnership resource available for writers, producers, studio executives, standard and practice people under the umbrella of the National Mental Health Awareness Campaign. The Speakers Bureau is now merged into an organization called Active Minds, which has chapters on 450 college campuses, which is the student voice of mental health, which is really where the destigmatization and conversation and peer-to-peer help and help towards making others that need help feel free enough to go and seek it. So this is now something that I'm very proud that it lives on, and there is an Active Mind chapter here at UCLA.
That is wonderful. That's wonderful. Good work. Good work. Good work. And then I have partnered with the National Alliance on Mental Illness to expand a program, again, that's aimed at children, at middle school children and high school children. And this peer-to-peer, where someone comes in who's had an issue and speaks to the classes. And it's in 31 states, and they wanted to expand it to all of the states, and that's what we're in the process of doing. So it's just so important to educate everybody, but if you start with kids, whenever they can begin to understand, and middle school is probably the right time, these issues and what to do if they have a friend who's contemplating suicide or who's has an issue that's clearly visible to them, but maybe not to anybody else. The family might be in denial. What do they do? Who do they talk to? So we give them tools, education and tools in which to deal with mental health issues in the schools.
This is all, for me, very uplifting, because when we see a problem, we also see a solution. And but yet I do see some problems that I think that we can just throw out, and which are kind of sad for us all as a society. The prison system and the jails have become the mental health institutions. So the largest mental health services, which are so rare and very difficult, are just in 3 prisons alone, one in California and one in New York, Rikers Island, and one in Florida. And there are more people that need care, obviously, but there is something wrong when our prisons become the institutions that are serving those with mental health needs. And in hearing about it, which again, we will get happy in a minute, but in hearing about it, for women, more than 30% of women who are in the prisons were abused as children. And then another 30 or 40 or even more percent abused in abusive relationships in one way or another. So we're talking about the need for treatment for situations, particularly for women, that are not being met and that are resulting in this huge prison population. 1 in 2 people in prison are mentally ill. So that's my first little speech of what I think we still need to address and the country needs to address. And the second really is that there's such a need for mental health professionals, both in the counseling centers on college campuses, but that is being changed, and also at the community level, because the pay for young clinicians at the community level is much lower than the pay, for example, from Kaiser Permanente or large organizations. So where the actual on-the-ground treatment is needed, those people are being siphoned off. And those are the two areas that I really feel that is the problem part, but I know in this group, maybe there'll be some solutions and we can keep working on those.
Another area, though, that's problematic and for our society, and it's very difficult, is the homeless population. And I have spent many years struggling and working with this population, struggling for policy answers back when I could, but so many of the homeless people are also mentally ill. A lot of them are veterans. And, you know, it's just, the question is in our society, whether it's prisons, whether it's the homeless population that you see, if you're in any position to do something good or something positive about any of this, it's so important. And I think that it takes somebody that feels it in order to work in that area or give to an organization that is helping in that area if you don't want to go be on the streets yourself or whatever. I did that. I once volunteered with a van that did healthcare for the homeless, mentally ill. And it's very time consuming, but you can actually develop some trust and bring them into crisis housing and then transitional housing. And I have some success stories where people were stabilized enough to, you know, live on their own and have a job. But it's very labor intensive. But all of these areas in our society need our attention.
Kudos, hats off to you, Thank you.
I just want to insert another little lighter note into this, which is that Tipper, who has, I'm sure, many hobbies that I don't know about, but beyond a hobby, Tipper was a photojournalist and takes remarkable pictures. And her photographs of starving children in Rwanda, as well as homeless people that she encountered when she literally went on the streets to feed them, are really quite remarkable. And there are some, as well, beautiful photographs at your website. Still, are they up?
Oh, yes.
Oh,
yes, they are.
Please tell everybody.
Oh, well, okay. I didn't expect this. Sorry. Thank you, Gail.
You're welcome.
I do have a website, tippergore.com, but that's not the point. But thank you. I do love to take photographs, and I've been doing that for many years as well.
And I think way back I remember you said that it was the easiest way for you to look out while people were snapping photographs in.
Back during the 90s, I often hid behind my camera. It was great. Yes, you're right.
So we'll get back to a little bit about the homeless, but Nancy, tell us about being a U.S. ambassador to the United Nations.
So I'm going to stand for 1 minute because I want to be an advocate for the sometimes maligned United Nations. It is the global tent. We need it. We are so interconnected, interdependent, and intergenerational. And honestly, the progress that we all hope to see is in all of our hands. The UN serves to provide great roadmaps for all of the most intractable problems. I began with the UN, having gone to the first, actually the second, and third international conferences on the status of women, where women of the world came to solve the problems and formulate a plan of action. It was then that I realized that it wasn't the people with titles who really controlled and excited the progress that each individual could make, but those on the front lines, and that includes men. So for the men who showed up today, a particular bravo. My portfolio was to cover the human rights abuses in 163 nations. It's a big agenda. Madeleine Albright was the first female Secretary of State. I had the pleasure of working under her and with figures like Ambassador Holbrooke and others. But to spice this up just a little, I want to tell you a story about my work in war-torn countries and my meeting of Princess Diana. And I mention her because of mental health issues and what she brought at her very vulnerable time to underscore what each of us has to bring. While she was working on landmines, she changed the attitude of those with AIDS and the attitude of all of us towards those with AIDS as she clutched the hand and was photographed worldwide, saying, "This is not catching." She changed the attitudes on mental health around bulimia as she was suffering through it, and the numbers of people going to look for health care in Great Britain skyrocketed. And as an aside, you all know that her sons are now carrying the mental health campaign throughout Great Britain. But in 6 degrees of separation, it turns out that her son's fiance, Megan, had a mother who was a social worker and worked at the D.D. Hirsch Community Mental Health Centers. So another small story about how life in chapters connects and reconnects in many wonderful ways.
Nancy, I would love to let us go on and on. I'm getting a signal from behind your head. So I think that we need to go forward with discussing. Are there a few more things, or could you then
We'll
wrap
go
it
right to
in what
the progress
where we're
being
going?
made.
Good.
Okay. I do want to say this, one last thing. In underscoring the relevance of our voices at every place of your work and engagement, I hope you will see yourselves and have your kids see themselves as global citizens and take their work with a sense of a ripple out, like the women's marches, like the March for Our Lives. That which we engage in has incredible relevance as it moves throughout the rest of the world, and we are so in partnership. Now on to
where do you see the needs, the solutions, where the women's movement is, and what we can do going forward. Is there anything you would like to add?
I would like to add something briefly. I think that it's so encouraging to see the young people ignite and take fire from Parkland all around the country and even before then. And let's keep them engaged. Reach out from whatever organization you're with and bring them in, welcome them, work with them. And I think it's really heartening to see the women's movement, of which we're all a part, be brought into the mainstream. And I know that's going to continue, and I think if all of us are just aware of that and keep working in our areas, that will empower so many more women and will continue to grow and continue to be in the mainstream. And that is what is eventually, along with good education, going to change the culture that some of us can look back on and see needed to be changed and create the future that all of us wish to see. Thank you.
Thank you.